Today I'm going to go over an example where a Winston-Salem home seller and a home buyer were both in breach of contract, and I'm going to talk about which was the most serious. So first, the home seller refused to give the buyer the residential property disclosure before the buyer made an offer, which they're required to do. So for whatever reason, the buyer made an offer anyway using standard offer to purchase Form 2T. Once they were under contract, the seller still refused to give the buyer the residential property disclosure. Because of this, the buyer refused to pay the due diligence fee. Because the buyer refused to pay the due diligence fee, the seller did not allow the buyer to have access to the property. Okay, so now let's go over the situation. The home seller, the consequences for the home seller not providing the property disclosure is that the buyer will have a 3-day window with which to terminate the contract or the offer and be eligible to receive a refund of the due diligence fee. So once that 3-day window is passed, there's really no risk to the seller of losing the due diligence fee. The buyer is obligated to pay that due diligence fee as soon as they are under contract. It is due by the effective date. If they fail to pay, the seller has the right to terminate the contract, and then the buyer would be liable for not only the due diligence fee, but also the earnest money. And if the seller has to take legal action, then the buyer would also be on the hook for attorney's fees, court costs, that sort of thing. The seller is obligated to provide access to the property even though the due diligence fee has not been paid. It's not contingent on payment of the due diligence fee, but they're in the driver's seat in this example because they could terminate the contract for the buyer's failure to pay the due diligence fee. They need to go through some steps like providing a written notice and so forth, but they could do it. So the most important thing that needs to happen in this example is for the buyer to pay that due diligence fee. After they do that, then they could apply pressure to make the seller give access to the property. I think it's highly likely that once the seller received the due diligence fee that they would provide access to the property. I think being upset about the property disclosure seems to be a bit overblown by the buyer, since the seller has the option of making no representation on the property disclosure. If it was that important to them, then they probably shouldn't have made an offer in the first place. Thanks.